Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall, who is the line editor for Lords of the Middle Sea and the creative director of all things BRP at Chaosium. We talked about prep. We spend a lot of time on this channel talking about tips for writing and designing your own tabletop role playing games and what you can do while you're running a game, but we don't really talk about preparing beforehand that much. So, Jason here shares a bunch of advice. I started off the interview by asking him how he personally preps to run sessions. I'll jump across to the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
Well, normally the prep really depends on what the game is and my familiarity with it is. And also in some cases, whether I'm running at a convention, if it's a first time, a demo where I'm really trying to impress a bunch of players, or if I'm running a sort of, beer and pizza kind of event, or like a laid back thing with friends. So let's just go at the highest level first. So I would make sure that the character sheets and everything that I hand to the players is detailed and laid out. Sometimes that can be a rules summary, ideally something that can be printed on a single page and put on the back of a character sheet so you could just flip over and see everything you need to for basic rules like how do you roll dice, how do you read the dice, what are basic how do I attack someone, how do I, and that sort of thing I find super useful. And I usually either, find a summary of the rules online if it's a game I don't know, at like the back of my hand, or write my own sometimes. If I'm trying to learn a new system, I find that literally just taking the core rules and writing a summary of the rules is one of the best ways to learn how to play. I always use pre-generated characters when I'm prepping for, games that aren't with my familiars, because I find that character creation can often be kind of time consuming and sometimes a little unpredictable. You never know if you're going to end up with a character who's just playing a complete off the wall, unable to work well with or sync with the rest of the party, and sometimes that can be a huge diversion. So those are the things. Anything that I need to hand players, I prep first. That's always the way I've done it. And that can be sometimes spell summary cards, uh, any critical combat things. There's usually a map if that's available. And then I will prepare, if it's a setting the players don't know, I usually prepare a little boiled down, like 1 or 2 paragraph, quick description or a few bullet points to let them know what they need to know. From my end, if I'm prepping to run a module or a scenario that's been pre-written, I go through it carefully. I annotate it. I usually print it out, even if I have a physical copy of it. And I write notes in the margins. I highlight things. I summarize. I draw little arrows. I make sure that if there's a reference to something in the book, I have a page reference. I make it very easy for myself. I kind of think, let's have now Jason make things really easy for future Jason when he's running this, to minimize the amount of page flipping and whatnot. And then I just, try to think of the focus. I break down each scene or each encounter or each location and try to come up with whatever is the dominant, I guess, the high level point to that. Sort of like in Hollywood, where they're always like, start late, leave early. Always try to kind of figure out a way to make each encounter really tight and fun. And then, I sometimes figure out ways to patch things. Like if the players miss a valuable clue or they don't follow a particular lead, I sometimes try to circle things that I can shuffle around and ultimately just try to push things to a satisfying conclusion, whether it's a pre-scripted conclusion or something that emerges organically from what the players have engineered.
Are there a set of tools that you use to know when you've done enough prep? And this is kind of a wide situational thing. You might be running for a convention, you might be running for friends. When do you know within yourself that you've done enough?
When I can sort of skim through the material I prepped and I realize that I can handle it, or at least I can handle everything that I've brought to the table. Like the players are always going to throw curveballs. They're going to, create circumstances that I did not anticipate. And may have never even imagined would happen, and they'll derail plots, and whatnot. And that's entirely possible and all good. But for me, one of the things that I try to do is make sure that, as far as I'm concerned, everything is covered. The stuff that I find is the most difficult is just understanding how to make combat work. That of almost every single game I've played, everything comes to a screeching halt if combat suddenly bogs down. And so I try to be really good about knowing how to get combat moving smoothly so that everybody can, figure out what they want to do and how they want to do it and resolve it as quickly as possible, because combat also has the circumstance in which it can, if players are not engaged, then it can be really, really boring for them. So I generally want to pull past to get to other scenes. So usually there. And I mean, sometimes my prep for games can be literally like a handful of notes on a note card, a few sticky notes in a rule book for NPC write-ups, generic NPC write-ups if I need them, and then go. I mean, I've run games literally with a first sentence of description and then a question, and let the players guide it from there.
If you are under time pressure and you haven't got enough free space to get all the prep you need done, what are the critical things you're doing?
I would say characters, make sure your characters are ready to go, and just sort of a high level outline, like even a flow chart to just say, how do you want the adventure to go and how do you get from point A to point X or, Z, whatnot. You really just, just a few key things. Sometimes I also find, and I mean, this is just a crazy thing, I find just writing a list of sample names on a note card is one of my favorite tricks, because like male and female names, or I just mix and match. I have a bunch of surnames and, for personal names. And I have found that if you can convincingly pull a random name off a note card and sound like it's a real person, and, just psychologically, I say I'll base it on, my grade school math teacher, or, a college professor I had, or the guy who works at the key shop down the road, like a physical description pulled from real life, and a convincing sounding name. And then I just annotate that like on the card as I'm going. I circle each name and I just write, this character is done. And the players, it adds that verisimilitude. It's like they think, oh, we're not in random stuff territory. This is a real character. So you can embed a lot of creative work in the game on the fly like that, without too much work.
You mentioned circling a name and taking that further. One of the things I find with prep is that running the first session can be very, very different from running subsequent ones. And a big part of prep is taking what's happened once and moving it forward.
Yes.
How do you approach that?
For games that I run a continual on a continual basis, I usually create a Google sheet that everyone can contribute to. And I list session by session, like what's happening, which players were there, what happened in the session. I usually even list like what date the actual sessions was played on, what the rewards, what the unanswered questions were. And so then that's usually very easy. And then just before the session, I'll go through and look at the Google sheet and go, oh, yeah, that's right. I need to follow up about that cursed violin, or I need to write a little thing about that mysterious NPC they encountered, or I need a stat block for their new grave digging apprentice that they made friends with while, exhuming a sorcerer's body in the town cemetery.
I asked you, if you don't have enough time, what you tend to make. If you have a wealth of time, what's a not necessarily a luxury in that it's not that useful, but what's something that is incredibly time consuming to do, but that adds a lot?
I would say little character packets, where you literally can, like those here in Germany, you can find them anywhere. There's little plastic sleeves, where you've got a pre-prepared character sheet, you've got a little background information, you've got a summary of the rules, and any sort of particularly pertinent information. Like if the character is a magic user, you just have this is how to cast magic, these are all your spells, go. If the character has some sort of artifacts or things like that, and maybe even a map of their home territory. I think that is like kind of at the highest end of usefulness.
One of the situations I've found myself in a few times is having to prep while I'm running, which sounds kind of silly, but get myself into a situation where an odd direction is happening, I'm trying to sort of figure out the road as I'm going along it. Do you have any tips for people who find themselves in that situation? How do you prep while you're at the table?
Well, yeah, I think we've all been in the position of trying to, build the airplane as it's taking off, and so, or mid-flight. And so I find usually just to assemble things from bits and pieces as they as you find them, like basically take elements from other things and sort of cobble together these sort of Frankenstein scenarios and these bits and pieces, if that's making any sense. I basically take things that I know, like, oh, here's an encounter from a completely different adventure that, but I can sort of twist it and make it work for what I'm doing right now. And I find that kind of stuff can really help sort of create the framework. Steal liberally is what I'm saying, just try not to make it really obvious.
There's a stereotype around online that there's kind of people who are very low prep, players and GMs alike, and they'll never really swap out of that mold, and people who are very high prep and they need to have a whole bunch of resources and they need to be able to stick to that or things get off the rails. Do you believe that it really is a kind of binary like that, or is it a little more nuanced?
I can't speak to everyone, I don't spend a lot of time in other people's heads, but I think that it's always a mix, people have different style. I mean, I suppose there are people who just play the same game week after week after week and run it exactly the same way. And I think that maybe some of the more mechanistic games in the market encourage that sort of style of play. But I think that most people tend to mix it up here and there, and also I find that the greater your mastery of game rules, the more you know about, things like if you're playing a D&D game, for example, if you know how feats intersect with various combat maneuvers and conditions and all of that, and once you get a clear understanding of those kind of mechanics, you can generally run things a little more loose than having very crunchy combat notes. And I've seen scenarios where literally they, people have written them where they say, in this combat encounter, this character will do this on the first round and this on the second round and this on the third round. And I have no patience for that kind of detail because it almost inevitably falls apart instantly.
So on that note, then prep pitfalls. When do you know that you're making a mistake? I've had somebody tell me that if you are over prepping the beginning of something compared to the end, that's a great way to know that you're on the wrong track. I've had another friend with weary eyes say that you ever find yourself planning out planets for a traveler setting, you've gone too deep. Do you have any?
Okay. Yeah, I guess I would just say, it's really ultimately we're just creating these sort of Disneyland facades. They are these fake, there's a giant castle here, but you get to walk into the ballroom, and that's all you get to see. Everything else is blocked off by velvet ropes and curtains and whatnot. And if you find yourself sitting around and wondering, like, oh, but what is the cook's name and how many people are there in this, how many scullery maids are working in this particular keep, and where are the horses at? If you're like going into this nuts and bolts deep level, you're probably over prepping. If you're finding that you're making up or you need to have every possible contingency squared away, you're probably over prepping. And again, like I said, if you find yourself just completely it's almost like it sounds weird, but if you find yourself completely you've got all this material prepped and then your characters do something unexpected, you've probably prepared too much of the wrong thing. Like if you're expecting your scenario or your investigation or your encounter to go a particular way and suddenly the players are screeching over in the other direction, then I think you probably put too much on one side of that scale.
There are a lot of follow-up questions I want to ask, but a lot of them feed into managing a game or managing pacing or managing focus and keeping players on track. So to try and keep things on a prep focus and to also try and make sure that we don't make this video last forever, do you have any advice about kind of prep outside the game? Things like setting a good atmosphere, things like setting a time frame, anything along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's important to sort of make sure that whatever your wherever you're setting your game, wherever you're playing, is conducive to players getting into character and having fun, where people won't be tremendously self-conscious. Like here in Germany, because the weather is so nice, I tend to run a lot of games in beer gardens. They're absolutely fantastic, large environments, everyone can get food and drink. There's no there's nobody hustling the tables to make sure that you clear out after 2 hours. Um, and so which is absolutely fantastic. It means people can, do that. The negative side of that is that I don't find that that's very conducive to sort of deep role playing where characters are really in the zone. You can't add things like music. You can't really do a lot with little props or handouts or anything like that because the wind might blow them away. And sometimes there's just the distraction of children playing nearby or people chatting loudly at the table near you, which it tends to mean that games I run in the beer gardens are fairly lighter games, sort of drop in, whoever's here will run them, pre-gens, lighthearted, sometimes just pre-scripted adventures. But no, I find that things like music and sometimes lighting is good. I think it's easy to go overboard on that. I think that any lighting that means the characters can't read, if they've got to bring out their phones to shine their flashlights down on their character sheets, you've probably gone overboard on the moonlighting. But no, I think that there are some just very simple things you can do. Some ambient music in the background. I tend to just be a little more low key about that, like have something that feels nice and just let it play throughout. Because sometimes I've had too many situations where game masters are like, oh, let me cue up the combat music, and they're going like different music for different scenes, and it adds something, but at the same time, there's a high level of distraction that comes with that.
So, do you have any final thoughts, any last ideas you want to leave us with?
I would say ultimately one of the key things for prepping is sometimes just a nice physical artifact for the center of the table, if you're playing in a live thing. And that can be a map, that can be an interesting handout, that can be just something to make, like it can just be a message with a bloody corner on it or something like that, to just give the player some sort of a feeling that there's just to give them a focus point. And I find that is really cool. I was playing a game recently that I had kickstarted, and one of the rewards that I received was this gorgeous map printed on cloth by Francesca Berald, who did some maps for us for RuneQuest. And anyway, the map is just gorgeous. It's not normally the kind of thing that I spend the extra money on, but this is a thing. And when I had the characters say, oh, this NPC that you've just encountered, who is dying, he's got this bundled up wad of cloth in his, tucked into his shirt, and they open it up, and then I hand them this map, and they unfold it. They're like, and that sort of became the tablecloth, but also just it really was a wonderful focus. And so that's the kind of thing I think it required zero prep other than back the Kickstarter, but it did. It like literally it created a focal point for the entire session, that they could sort of, whenever I mentioned a place, they could look it up, they could see, they had a very clear idea about what, where things were, but also it sort of crossed that weird boundary between just being a game aid and a prop.